Thank you, Chris, and welcome everybody. Today I'm going to explain a major objective, often unstated, of most of our clients, and that's how to fund their reserves but minimize their reserve contributions in the process. So, how do you accomplish your funding objective but minimize your reserve contributions? If that's what you want to find out, you're in the right place. As Chris mentioned, my name is Robert Nordlund. Presuming the component list is stable and accurate, I've enjoyed studying ways to perform the financial analysis, testing different methods to find their strengths and weaknesses. We want to offer the best to our clients. Because there's rumors and stereotypes about different methods, I enjoy bringing truth and clarity to the subject, kind of like myth busting. To do this, I often speak in front of groups, but today I have the disadvantage of not being able to see you. So we've got to do a few things slightly differently than if we were in a room together. So if you've come with a specific question in mind, or if at any time you have a question, you're going to have to type it into the question section of your dialog box. I'm showing it here on screen, and it'll probably look very similar to this off to the right-hand side of your screen. And in addition, to get some periodic feedback from you, because this is a live webinar, I'll ask you to raise your hands in response to a point that I've made. You'll see that in the same control panel or dialog box area. So let's test that right now. Give me a hands raised to show me you're with me. You found the hands raised button and you're following along. Okay, hands raised, everyone. Great. Yes, it's going to be an interactive program. Okay, thank you all very much. Hands down. Okay, reserve contributions are important as the size of reserve contributions is often the key result people expect or dread from their completed reserve study. While the other two results of a reserve study, the reserve component list and the evaluation of reserve fund strength, are disclosures as of the first day of the association's fiscal year, this is the only one of the three key results that is a recommendation for action. Checks get written and money gets transferred. So contributions rightfully deserve special attention, which is the reason for today's webinar. In today's webinar, you'll see side by side the strengths and weaknesses of the two main funding methods for computing reserve contributions, what flexibility you have in reserve contributions by selecting different objectives, and the bottom line is how to accomplish your objective or goal all while minimizing your reserve contributions. You want to set aside the right amount of reserves and not get caught with inadequate funds, but on the other hand, you don't want to ask too much of your homeowners in the way of high reserve contributions. The concepts I'll be explaining today are all National Reserve Study standards, not just my opinion or what we do here at Association Reserves. I'll be using straightforward examples using these national standard terminologies and principles, doing the math to bring some clarity and insight to issues that are regularly misinterpreted. So since 1998, these National Reserve Study standards have helped our industry by giving us consistent terminology and principles, minimum standards and contents in a reserve study, minimum required disclosures like the fiscal year end of the reserve study or the type of reserve study performed and the objective of the funding plan, and of course a national credential for professionals like myself who prepare reserve studies for associations. These National Reserve Study standard principles are key. Every time I discuss a significant point or term that's national standards based, you'll see this blue NRSS ribbon on your screen. So let's start with the National Reserve Study Standard Principles for Creating Reserve Contributions, which is officially called the Reserve Funding Plan. So what are these four funding principles? Number one, it's providing adequate cash to the association when needed. Second is creating a funding plan that's stable and fair from one year to the next. Third is creating a funding plan that's evenly distributed across the ownership base, current and future owners. And finally, a multi-year funding plan that's fiscally safe and responsible. so the board and homeowners can both sleep well at night. The reason this is a challenge is that fundamentally we're faced with the problem of balancing irregular expenses through the years with a stable and fair income stream. As you saw on the last slide, reserve funding principles emphasize stability and fairness. That's a challenge when, by definition, the expenses are irregular. Let me show you what I mean. This is a chart showing reserve expenses through the years for a typical association. Yours probably looks something like this. Some years have high expenses and some years have low or no reserve expenses. There's nothing regular or smooth about it. This means that your reserve balance needs to grow in the low expense years, so the reserve fund will be ready and prepared for those large expense years when the reserve fund will drop. I want to make sure you know where reserve contributions fit into the big picture of a reserve study. There are three results from a reserve study. The first is the component list, something we call the foundation of the reserve study. This is because it defines the scope and schedule of the reserve expenses. The second is the computation of reserve fund strength, measured by percent funded. And the third is the computed reserve funding plan, which is the topic of today's webinar. While we're able to spend more time on the component list in our RS 101 curriculum and strength calculations in our RS 102 curriculum, in this session we'll take the time to look into the important decisions and issues having to do with methods used to calculate the funding plan and a description of the different objectives or goals that you can choose. In the big picture, there's four ways to fund reserves. Budgeted reserve contributions will be the focus of today's webinar. Another strategy or a fallback position is to levy special assessments or to take out loans as needed. And finally, you can pay for reserves by not doing your reserve projects, suffering a loss of home value. So I want to emphasize that due to compound interest, making appropriately sized budgeted reserve contributions is by far the cheapest way to pay for reserve projects, and it's the most fair. So since minimized reserve contributions is a theme in today's presentation, I'll move forward on my comments today, focusing on making appropriately sized and minimized budgeted reserve contributions. Here's a sample reserve component list. It generated that graph of expenses that I showed just a couple moments ago. It's nothing special, just a simple list of a few components that I'll use for the examples in today's seminar. They're a nice array of projects with different useful lives, that's the UL field, and a good scatter of remaining useful life estimates, the RUL column, and a normal variety of small and large current replacement costs. I'll start off by illustrating how the straight line method works. Officially, it's called the component method in National Reserve Study Standards, but for the years before National Reserve Study Standards, and to this day, it's still commonly known as the straight line method. I'll try to mostly use official terminology through today's session, but you do need to understand that component method and straight line are the same thing. The component method has a reputation as being simplistic, and you'll see that that indeed is a problem when you apply it to a real-world situation. It's inflexible in that it only directs an association towards full funding, and it does so rapidly. It has a reputation as being unfair because it rapidly, and perhaps too rapidly, pushes an association towards full funding. In its simplest use, the contributions are calculated on a component-by-component basis, hence the name, and summed together at the bottom like this. For this example component list, the component method reserve contributions come to $20,170 per year. Let me show you how this is done. Here I've highlighted the important columns. The current cost is divided by the useful life to result in the recommended reserve contributions. For instance, while you may not be able to read it on screen, the second line item is a pool resurface project with a $10,000 current cost and a useful life of 10 years. So the annual reserve contributions are calculated to be, there you go, $1,000 a year. The same calculation is done for each component, resulting in recommended reserve contributions of $20,170 per year for the association. But let's see what happens in reality when this association begins making $20,170 per year reserve contributions. We know from industry statistics that most associations have a fair reserve fund. So let's assume this association starts off being 50% funded, which is in the middle of the fair range. So based on this component list, 50% funded for this association this year is $77,050. So let's start this association off with $77,050 in its reserve fund, and let's watch and see what happens. Adding $20,170 per year to the starting balance and subtracting those reserve expenses as they occur results in the reserve balance becoming completely depleted in the 6th year. What went wrong? In its simplest form, the component method presumes the association is 100% funded, which isn't the case for most associations. So unfortunately, this association, like most associations, is not 100% funded. The simplest form of the component method is not sensitive to the cash needs of the association. So this reserve fund is not strong enough to survive on the contributions calculated by the simple form of the component method. So years ago, the component method was improved, making it sensitive to the cash needs of the association. We'll call this the cash-enhanced component method, and I'll show you how it works. We'll take the association's $77,050 and spread it evenly among the reserve components. So each component has 50% of its computed fully funded balance. Seems reasonable. This is a good correction because it shows how much each component has and how much each component has left to collect before it's to be replaced. With this adjustment, the calculation is a little different. Instead of the replacement cost being divided by the useful life, in this enhancement, the amount that remains to be collected is divided by the number of years until the component is to be replaced, meaning the remaining useful life. The result is that appropriate reserve contributions are now calculated to be $57,647 per year, a very big increase. Taking the amount left to be collected for each component and spreading it over as much time as available before each component is to be replaced results in a whopping increase in calculated reserve contributions. While this is better because it guarantees funds will be there when needed, which is reserve funding principle number 1, the contribution rate unfortunately jumped way higher. This chart shows the cash balance in reserves through the years by following this contribution plan. The reserve fund doesn't run out of money, but it runs into another problem, accumulating arguably too much cash. Fortunately, there's a way to optimize even further the distribution of reserve funds among the components in order to minimize your reserve contributions. It's a process where we allocate the reserve funds to the components that need it first on the basis of remaining useful life rather than making an even distribution of the funds across the components like I showed in the last example. I did that exercise on my own time, and here's the results. As you can see, the basic method results in the lowest reserve contribution rate, but it causes, as you saw, the reserve fund to run out of money, or in our terms, it crashes and burns. The cash-enhanced method solves the running out of money problem, but it creates its own problem by way of high reserve contributions that no one wants to implement. It's almost 3 times what was computed in the basic method. The optimization is an effective exercise because it drops the recommended reserve contributions down to about the $33,000 per year range. But still, you wonder if this is the best that can be done. We've had to do a lot of fiddling around in order to get this $33,304 per year contribution rate. And we still haven't mentioned the point that we really should be preparing for future expenses, not just current expenses. Now you're starting to see the complications begin to build. What you really get from straight line calculations is a headache. Too many things to remember, too many adjustments to make, too many variables to consider. So what you find out when you run the numbers is that the straight line method or component method is not as simple as usually presumed. It's inflexible in that it pushes the association to the arguably good fully funded level, but it does so rapidly that it pushes people, and no one likes to be rushed. And finally, the reserve contributions seem high. 33,604 was not as high as the 57,647 that we calculated, but it's a lot higher than the initially tempting 20,170. And again, remember, we haven't even made the adjustments for future costs. So I rate this as a failed experiment. Too many complications, no advantages. So we turn to the cash flow method. This computation method has the reputation of being complex because you need to try and try again, testing different reserve funding plans in order to see if you get the desired result. It's not a direct calculation leading to a solution. Here, reserve income and expenses are calculated and summed for each of the 20 to 30 years considered in the reserve study. And if you don't like the results, you just test another contribution rate, or what we call a multi-year funding plan. But since it's a matter of testing and retesting different contributions through the years, this method is inherently flexible, and the results are limited only by the creativity of the user. But since the cash flow method was in the early years used to search for the lowest contribution that would keep the reserve fund cash positive, it's been branded with the reputation of being the way you calculate low reserve contributions. In unskilled hands, the cash flow method users often unfortunately find their association running out of money and running into special assessments. A bad reputation. So let's do the same thing. Let's run some numbers and do some tests on exactly what happens with that same component list as before. Here's a chart showing the annual reserve expenses projected by that reserve component list. It's the same chart I showed before. Again, it's this very standard scatter of seemingly random high and low reserve expenses through the years. It's the scope and schedule of the reserve projects at this association. And note that all costs in future years are inflated by the appropriate amount. So what do we do now? We pick a contribution rate and test it to see if it gives us success. But what is success? You have to ask, are we looking for a certain cash result, like keeping the reserve fund above zero? Or are we looking for a particular percent funded result, like 100% funded? So to start off, let's just keep it simple. Let's just find a contribution rate that keeps the reserve fund cash positive. Here I try the first test. Simply as a reasonable place to start, I try the component method's 20,170 per year as a starting point. You can see that the reserve fund balance through the years eventually runs out of money. But it does get a lot further than crashing in the 6th year that we saw when we calculated with the straight line method. So it's an interesting test, but I'd have to rate it as a failed test. Testing a number of other starting values on my own time, I found that when I used a starting contribution of 21,600 per year, I was successfully able to get the association through 30 years without running out of money. At the low point, sometimes called the pinch year or critical year, the association's reserve fund was projected to drop to a little under $2,000. But you ask, how can that be? How can we have success with reserve contributions of 21,600 per year? Didn't I just show a few moments ago that the component method calculated that we'd need 33,304, and that took some pretty significant optimizing, and it still didn't address future costs? Well, here's why. First, I set up the contributions in the cash flow method so they increase a little bit each year, growing with inflation. That's shown in the blue bars on the chart. The 33,304 contributions calculated with the straight line method are assumed to run for 30 years at a constant rate. Those are the white bars. While the total amount of cash collected through the years may total up with these two methods to be pretty much the same, a gradually increasing contribution rate is fairer through the years to current and future owners, and it also has the advantage of providing lower contributions. I want to asterisk that because that's what we care about. This is not a matter of pushing off contributions onto the shoulders of future owners. Use of the cash flow method allows you to design a funding plan that's smoother and fairer overall, eliminating the cold slap in the face that comes with the straight line calculations. And in addition, we changed the objective. Straight line calculations were pointing the association towards full funding, while what we just accomplished was the lower objective of only being baseline funded. And that's of the three funding objectives itemized in National Reserve Study standards. You see, baseline contributions just barely keep the association's reserve fund cash positive. In some years, that's just barely. And as you can imagine, this minimal reserve funding results in the lowest contributions. That's good, but those contributions result in risky results. Now let me explain. Here I've plotted those same results on a percent funded basis instead of a cash basis. You can see that there are a number of years the association's reserves are down in the 0 to 30% weak range, where there's just about a 1 in 3 chance of special assessment in any year they're in that range. So this association has no margin for the realities of expenses. There's a number of years they're at high risk of special assessment. There's no free lunch. Lower contributions allow you to have a lower reserve fund, but that riskiness means that you have a high exposure to special assessments. Now, I did a few minutes in preparation doing some testing with this analysis, gradually adjusting the contribution rate higher and higher, looking for a funding plan that would gradually push the association up to the 100% funded level. And here you can see the results. Tweaking the contributions up to $26,500 per year put the association on a path towards full funding. It takes a few years. You can see that they steadily approach and stabilize in the 100% range, spending no time in the 0 to 30% weak range. With this funding plan, the association enjoys a very low risk of special assessment. Let me stop here and get a show of hands. Everyone with me seeing that in a full funding plan, this association spends no time in the 0 to 30% weak range? That's the advantage of full funding. No time in the 0 to 30% weak range. Great. Okay, thank you all. I'm going to put your hands down. To summarize, I just used the cash flow method to design a very conservative funding plan for the association to become fully funded, and the contributions were only $26,500 per year. But we're back to that very important question. How can that be? With straight line calculations, we found it took $33,304 per year to become fully funded. The answer is that the cash flow method allows you to design a smooth funding plan, one that gradually approaches an objective. And in addition, the cash flow method in theory is based on, I shouldn't say that, the component method is based on different buckets of cash. There's no sharing between asphalt money and roof money and fence replace money. They're all different buckets of cash, each getting ready to be spent on their own particular project. That's in the component method. And in the cash flow method, there's no such thing. The entire reserve fund is one reservoir of money to be used as needed for the budgeted reserve projects. An association can successfully function when less than 100% funded by drawing cash as needed from the main reserve account, replenishing with budgeted contributions. As I indicated earlier, in years of big reserve expenses, the reserve cash balance will gradually drop, and in years when there's not big reserve expenses, the reserve cash balance will grow, strengthening for the next big expense year. So in summary, while the cash flow method requires the user the complexity of trying and trying again to find the desired solution, fundamentally, because of its flexibility to produce all different types of results, it's earned its reputation for a way to develop minimized reserve contributions. So I give this methodology a passing grade. And now that I've illustrated the difference between the two most common calculation methods, I want to spend a couple moments focused on simply the difference between full funding and baseline, isolating those two issues. With full funding, the contributions are obviously higher, but the risks are lower. The question is the risk of lower special assessment worth it? Well, let's remind ourselves of what we've learned. If you've been taking notes, you've got these numbers, but let me show them on screen for you. Baseline contributions were $21,600 per year, and full funding contributions were $26,500 per year. That's only 18% different. Not twice as much, not half again as much, just 18% different. And here's how it looks graphically. On average, among our clients, we find full funding contributions to only be 13% higher than baseline funding contributions. Full funding contributions are higher because they pay for exactly the same reserve expenses, but they provide a margin of safety with a slightly higher reserve balance on an ongoing basis. And when you look at it on an overall association budget, that difference between fully funding your reserve fund and baseline funded contributions amounts to only about 3% of the association's total budget. Not a big deal. Yes, it's a risk management issue and money is usually tight at an association, but I'd argue that it's not a slam dunk decision. Full funding contributions are higher and they offer insulation against special assessments, but they're not prohibitively more expensive than baseline contributions. It's a very tempting strategy to play. Now, I'm good with numbers. I do this all the time, but I haven't done anything to trick you. It's all just really adding and subtracting. I ran a few cases on a very normal little reserve component list. When you take the time to do the math, the results are pretty straightforward. It's just that not too many people spend the time to check out their assumptions by doing the math, and that means a lot of stereotypes live on. What I've hopefully demonstrated is that there's value in pursuing results, not getting stuck on the stereotype that you need straight line calculations to become fully funded or cash flow calculations leading you to baseline funded. You want to maximize your results, which means minimizing your contributions. You want to follow National Reserve Study standard funding principles, and the cash flow method helps you do just that. So, how do you end up having success with your reserve funding plan? Pointing your associations towards a stronger future. And I've shown if you know what you're doing, you can get the results you want, even assuring your association that the recommended contributions truly have been minimized. But sometimes, and perhaps regularly, that means getting the assistance of a qualified reserve study professional, someone who does this all the time. And that's where we at Association Reserves can step in and help, making sure your funding plan is calculated with an effective computational tool used wisely based on National Reserve Study standards so your funding plan is fair and smooth while keeping an eye on minimizing your reserve contributions. This is not an area where you want to risk special assessments and big mistakes made in the interest of saving a few dollars of professional fees. And finally, make your reserve contributions. It makes no sense to craft a wise plan and then not follow that plan. Reserve expenses at your association are going to occur whether or not you're prepared financially. So you might as well buckle up and get prepared. Special assessments and loans are a very expensive way to pay for reserve expenses. There's no cheaper way to pay for reserve expenses than ongoing budgeted reserve contributions. So as long as you need to prepare for those expenses, you might as well prepare in the most cost-effective manner. so your common areas get the timely maintenance they need. And that concludes my prepared remarks on how reserve contributions are calculated and how to responsibly minimize your reserve contributions. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you've learned a few things that will help you make better decisions for your own association or the associations that you're responsible to manage. Looking at the clock, I believe we have a few minutes, so I'll now turn the floor back to Chris and have her coordinate a few questions. Chris?